So the type of breeding stock, your management practices on the farm, and the type of feeding or your feed formulation that you give to your pigs will be what will determine the growth rate of the pigs on your farm. Now today we are going to look at the feeding aspect. Like I always say, pigs have nutritional requirements. And so once their feed is lacking in the nutrients that they need, they are not going to grow. So if you have a feed formulation that you're using for your pigs, there are two major things that you should know about that feed that you've made. And that is the crude protein content and the crude fiber content. So in this video, you'll be able to know the crude protein and then the crude fiber requirement of starter feed, grower feed, and finisher feed. And then you also know the crude protein and then the crude fiber content of the feed ingredients, all the ingredients, maize, soya beans. You'd know their crude protein and crude fiber content. And also you'll be able to calculate the crude protein and crude fiber content of any feed formulation at all by the end of this video. So let's get right into it. So now let's look at starter feed, which is being given to starter or winner pigs. Now at this stage, your feed formulation should have a total crude protein content of 18% and a total crude fiber content of about 3 to 5%. For grower feed, it should have a total crude protein content of 16% and a total crude fiber content of 5 to 6%. And then for finisher feed, it should have a total crude protein content of 14% and a total crude fiber content that is also between 5 to 6%. Before we delve into how to calculate the crude protein and crude fiber content, let's look at the crude protein and the crude fiber content of the feed ingredients. Because mind you that the total crude protein and the total crude fiber content of your feed is going to be based on the individual crude protein and crude fiber content of the individual ingredients that you have used in your feed formulation. So now let's look at that. So let's make it into a table form so that it will be easier for you to always refer to it. So let's put our carbohydrate ingredients, which are our maize and our cassava meal, and then our protein ingredients, which are our fish meal, soya beans, groundnut cake, bone meal, and then blood meal. And then our fiber ingredients, which are our wheat bran, rice bran, maize bran, spent grains, and then PKC. So on the top part, let's put the average crude protein and then the average crude fiber content. So for maize, its average crude protein content is 8.23% and the average crude fiber content is 2.2%. For cassava meal, it has a crude protein content of 5% and an average crude fiber content of 5% as well. Now let's move on to our proteins. Fish meal has a crude protein content of 55% and a crude fiber content of about 1%. Our soya beans has a crude protein content of 45% and a crude fiber content of about 3.5%. So our groundnut cake has a crude protein content of 45% and an average crude fiber content of about 5.7%. Now let's look at bone meal. Bone meal has an average crude protein content of 50% and a crude fiber content of about 2%. And blood meal has a crude protein content of about 80% and a crude fiber content of 1%. So now let's move to our fiber ingredients. Wheat bran has an average crude protein content of 11% and an average crude fiber content of 10.5%. So wheat bran, rice bran, and then maize bran have a similar amount of crude protein and crude fiber. Now the only thing is that comparing these three fiber sources in terms of their crude protein content, wheat bran has the highest, followed by rice bran and then maize bran. And then in terms of the crude fiber content, rice bran has the highest, followed by maize bran and then wheat bran. So these three ingredients, like I already said in the previous video, they can be used interchangeably because they have almost the same crude fiber and then crude protein content. Now let's look at our spent grains. Spent grains have a wide range of crude protein values. So by calculation, the average crude protein of spent grains is 22% and the average crude fiber content is 21%. Now for PKC, it's the same thing. The values of crude protein and crude fiber have a wide range. So by calculation, the average crude protein content of our PKC is 16% and then the average crude fiber is also 16%. So now we can use these values in our calculations, and at least it will help us to have an idea of the crude protein and then the crude fiber content of our feed formulations. So now let's go into the calculation of the crude protein and the crude fiber content of our feed formulation. So to calculate the crude protein content of an ingredient with respect to the amount or the kilograms of that ingredient that you used, then it is going to be equal to the kilograms of the ingredients that you used times the average crude protein content of that ingredient. Now let me simplify that. So let's say you've used 10 kilograms of maize, right? And you want to find the crude protein content of that 10 kilograms of maize. It is going to be the kilograms of the ingredients, which is the 10, times the average crude protein content of maize, which is 8.23%. So now you have 10 times 8.23%. So the answer that you get for that is the crude protein content of that kilogram of ingredients that you've used. In the same way, the crude fiber content of an ingredient is equal to the kilograms of that ingredient used times the average crude fiber content of the ingredient. So let's take an example of a starter feed formulation so that you'll be able to get it better. So we are going to take one of the formulations that we already have on this channel. So you remember this feed formulation that we did. If you've not watched this video, I'll put the link above. So we derived several feed formulations that meet the requirements for starter pigs. So let's take the feed 4 and then see how to go about the calculation. So again, I'm going to use a table to make everything very simple. So we have the feed ingredient here, then we have the kilograms of the ingredients used, the crude protein content of the kilograms of the ingredients used, and the crude fiber content of the kilograms of that ingredient used. So the feed ingredients that we used were maize, cassava meal, soya beans, groundnut cake, bone meal, and wheat bran. So from our feed formulation that we did, we used 40 kilograms of maize, 18 kilograms of cassava meal, 20 kilograms of soya beans, 5 kilograms of groundnut cake, 2 kilograms of bone meal, and 15 kilograms of wheat bran. So we've already established that the crude protein per kilograms of the ingredients used is equal to the kilograms of the ingredients used times the average crude protein content of the ingredient. So following this formula to calculate the crude protein for each ingredient, for maize is going to be 40 times 8.23%, which is going to give us 3.292. For our cassava meal, it's going to be 18 times 5%, and that will give us 0.9. For our soya beans, it's going to be 20 times 45%, and that will give us 9. For our groundnut cake, it's going to be 5 times 45%, and that will give us 2.25. For our bone meal, it's going to be 2 times 50%, and that will give us 1. And then for our wheat bran, it's going to be 15 times 11%, which will be equal to 1.65. So let's calculate the crude fiber content as well. We've also established that the crude fiber per kilograms of ingredients used is equal to the kilograms of the ingredients times the average crude protein content of the ingredient. So for maize, it's going to be 40 times 2.2%, which will give us 0.88%. For cassava meal, it's going to be 18 times 5%, which will give us 9. For soya beans, it is going to be 20 times 3.5%, and that will give us 0.7. For groundnut cake, it is going to be 5 times 5.7%, which will give us 0.285. And then for bone meal, it's going to be 2 times 2%, and that will give us 0.04. And for wheat bran, it's going to be 15 times 10.5%, and that will give us 1.575. So find the total for the crude protein is going to give us 18.092. And then finding the total for the crude fiber is going to give us 4.38. So it means that the crude protein content of this feed is 18.092% and the crude fiber is 4.38%. Now let's compare this to the nutritional requirements for starter pigs, because remember this is starter feed. So we said they need a crude protein content of 18% and then a crude fiber of 3 to 5%. Now let's compare and see. It falls within the range 18.092%. It's approximately 18.1%, which is still around our 18% mark. And then the crude fiber is 4.38. Now it falls between the 3 to 5%. So we are within range. So it means that this feed meets the requirements for starter feed. Now let's take another example. Maybe let's take for grower feed, one of our grower feed formulations, and let's also see how that will be. Let's see whether the formulation that we had will meet the requirement. Let's take feed 6 because it has all the 3 fiber components in. So it will be a good avenue for us to check on the crude fiber content if it exceeded it. So we had our feed ingredients to be maize, soya beans, wheat bran, spent grains, and then PKC. And then at the kilogram section, this is what we used. We used 54 kilograms of maize, 16 kilograms of soya beans, 15 kilograms of wheat bran, 5 kilograms of spent grains, and 10 kilograms of PKC. So for the crude protein content, remember the formula is the kilograms of the ingredient you use times its average crude protein content. So for maize, it's going to be 54 times 8.23%, which will give us 4.4442. And then for soya beans, it's going to be 16 times 45%, and that will give us 7.2. And for wheat bran, it's going to be 15 times 11%, and that will give us 1.65. And then for spent grains, it's going to be 5 times 22%, and that will give us 1.1. And then for PKC, it's going to be 10 times 16%, and that will give us 1.6. Now let's check on the crude fiber content, which is also going to be equal to the kilograms of the ingredient used times the average crude fiber content of that ingredient. So for maize, it's going to be 54 times 2.2%, and that will give us 1.188. For soya beans, it's going to be 16 times 3.5%, and that will be 0.56. For our wheat bran, it's going to be 15 times 10.5%, and that will give us 1.575. And then for our spent grains, it's going to be 5 times 21%, and that will give us 1.05. And then for our PKC, it will be 10 times 16%, which will be equal to 1.6. So now let's find the total. The total crude protein content by adding is going to give us 15.9942. And the total crude fiber content by adding is also going to give us 5.973. So now let's compare this to the nutritional requirement of growers. So now we said that for growers or for grower feed, we need a crude protein content of 16% and a crude fiber content between 5 to 6%. So this is our feed that we have. 15.9942 crude protein. Now that is almost 16%. Even if you round it up, you have 16%. So that meets the requirement. And then now for the crude fiber, we have 5.973. Now that is approximately 6%. So we are not out of range with the crude fiber as well. So this feed meets the nutritional requirement of grower feed so far as crude protein and crude fiber are concerned. So now let's take the last example, and then by then I think you'll be okay with these calculations. Let's take the last example from our finisher feed. Now these were the finisher feed formulations that we made. We made 6 of them. So let's just select one randomly and then try to calculate the crude protein content and the crude fiber content. So which one do we go for? Okay, let's take finisher feed 3. Okay, so let's take finisher feed 3 and then let's do the calculations. So the same table, feed ingredients, the kilograms, the crude protein, and then the crude fiber. So the ingredients that we use in our formulation for the finisher feed 3, the ingredients were maize, cassava meal, fish meal, granite cake, and then wheat bran. And then for the kilogram section, we used 30 kilograms of maize, 30 kilograms of cassava meal, 9 kilograms of fish meal, 5 kilograms of granite cake, and 26 kilograms of wheat bran. So now let's calculate the crude protein. For maize, it's going to be 30 times 8.23%, and that will give us 2.469. And then for cassava meal, it's going to be 30 times 5%, and that will give us 1.5. For fish meal, it's going to be 9 times 55%, and that will give us 4.95. For groundnut cake, it's going to be 5 times 45%, and that will give us 2.25. And then for our wheat bran, it's going to be 26 times 11%, and that will give us 2.86. Now let's do the same for our crude fiber content. For our crude fiber content, for maize, it's going to be 30 times 2.2%, and that will give us 0.66. And then for cassava meal, it's going to be 30 times 5%, and that will give us 1.5. And then for fish meal, it's going to be 9 times 1%, and that will give us 0.09. And then for groundnut cake, it's going to give us 5 times 5.7%, and that will give us 0.285. And then for our wheat bran, it's going to be 26 times 10.5%, and that will give us 2.73. Now let's find the total crude protein content. Now that will give us 14.029. And then the total crude fiber content will also give us 5.265. So now let's compare this to the nutritional requirement of finisher feed. We said for finisher feed, it needs a crude protein content of 14% and a crude fiber content that ranges between 5 to 6%. So now this our feed. We have 14.029 and we need 14%. So that is it. It meets it. It's okay, 14%. And then for our crude fiber, we have 5.265. And we said we need between 5 to 6%. So we fall within the range. So this finisher feed also meets it. So right now I am convinced that based on these that we've done, if you have your own formulation, you can take it and then go through the steps and then know the crude protein content and the crude fiber content of your feed. Now, if you take your feed formulation that you have, I'm sure most of us already have feed formulations that we give to our pigs. Now, if you take that feed formulation and then you follow these steps to calculate, and then your crude protein content or your crude fiber content is out of range and does not meet the nutritional requirements of that particular stage of the pigs, then you have to do adjustments. So let's say that you are making grower feed, and then after calculating, you have a crude protein content of say 14.5% and a crude fiber of let's say 7%. Now, this does not meet the requirement for grower pigs because we said for grower feed it's supposed to be 16%, and now you're having 14.5%. And then we said the crude fiber they need 5 to 6%, and you're having 7%, which is higher than we need. So since the crude protein content in your feed is low and your crude fiber is high, these are the remedies you can apply to your feed formulation. You have to increase the kilograms of your protein ingredient, or you introduce a new protein ingredient, especially the ones that lift the protein content up without affecting the fiber content, and that is bone meal and blood meal. They will increase the protein content of your feed without really touching the fiber because they have very low fiber, about 1 to 2% fiber. So they wouldn't worry the fiber content. And then now there's another thing you also do. You have to reduce the kilograms of the fiber ingredients in your feed or remove one fiber ingredient from your feed to lower the fiber content. So these are the kind of remedies that you can do. So now the adjustment that you do will be based on how close your calculated values are to the required values. So if they are very close, you do little adjustment, but if they are far apart, you have to do major adjustment in order to bring your feed formulation to meet the nutritional requirements of the pigs. Because what to be the essence if you are feeding your pigs something they don't need, if you are giving them too much fiber and they don't need the fiber, they will bring all out. You think that you are saving cost or you are giving them enough feed, but in the end they will not grow as you expect, and they will just pass out that fiber as waste. If you are giving them too much proteins than they need, mind you that it is enzymes in their system that break down these proteins. So if you are giving them more than they need, their system cannot break them down. They'll be wasting it. So just give them within the requirement. It shouldn't be below, it shouldn't be above. It should be somewhere around it or close to it. And then with that, you get the results that you want on your farm. the crude protein and the crude fiber content of your feed are very important to the growth of your pig. We already know that feeding is one of the major things if you want to experience a growth on your farm. So if you are downplaying your feed formulation, note that your pigs will just be anyhow. You don't even, I know people make feeds without even having an idea of what kilograms of ingredients they should put. They just know that they have maize, they have this, they just pour it together and give. But you should have an idea and it will help you track. Even the sex formulations that I give, you can just try some out and then monitor your pigs, see how they are responding to them. If you have a feed formulation, it is not something that is permanent. You try new ones out and see which one works best because in the end, it is profit that we want. So what can maximize your profit? What can maximize growth? What can maximize gains? And it is the feeding that will do that. If you're able to do that, it will go a long way to help you on the farm. So yeah, about the enzymes that I was talking about, there are enzymes, there are toxin binders, there are other things that aid the pig to be able to use the feed well. So the toxin binder will bind all the toxins in the feed and then help the pig in several ways. The enzymes too will be able to help the pig to process the feed better. So the other ones, premix. So in the next video, we are going to talk about feed additives. The additional things that we add, these are feed ingredients, and we have feed additives. So what we use in our calculations today were feed ingredients. So aside that, if you look at the feed formulations, there were some other ingredients at the bottom. Yes, we are going to talk about those ingredients. That's our amino acids, the lysine and then the methionine, the two of them. And then our toxin binder, enzymes, salts, our premix, dicalcium phosphate. How do these contribute to the well-being and then the growth of your pigs? We are going to look at them in depth. So if you're interested, I'll see you in the next video and it's a bye for now. Bye-bye.